Welcome to another episode of It Takes a Viking, the official podcast of the Salem State University Alumni and Friends community. My name is Mike Mitchell, Director of Engagement here at Salem State. Very excited to welcome to today's episode a graduate of the class of 1987 and the current District Attorney for Essex County, the Honorable Paul Tucker. D.A. Tucker, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Mike. Happy to be here. Thanks for the invitation.
Thank you very, very much. I know your job in and of itself must be a pretty chaotic one on a day-to-day basis, so we certainly appreciate you taking the time to join us. Very, very, very excited to share your story. I love your story, and I think it's going to resonate a lot with the folks that watch. The first question I always like to ask guests on the show is, what brought you to Salem State, and how did you end up here?
Yeah, it's actually a pretty multifaceted answer for such a nice, simple question. So I literally grew up in the shadow of then Salem State College, now university. So until I was about 8 years old, I grew up in public housing, which borders the campus, right behind what we call the student union at the time.
So I was Rainbow Terrace?
Rainbow Terrace. Yep. And I was on campus all the time, riding our bikes, always around, going to sporting events, even as a young person. I can tell you, I think the statute of limitations is over now, sneaking into concerts. When we were 12 and 13 years old, I snuck in to see the Guess Who that they played on campus. I always had some pretty good concerts on campus. Yeah. But this institution has been such a big part of my life. I had my first real full-time job here when I worked in, at the time, was called campus security. Now it's a fully staffed professional campus police department. And I was a student here, got my undergrad here. So this has been a huge part of my life. And I think just by virtue of being lucky to be born in the zip code that I was, to literally be in the shadow of the university and to have it be such a big part of my life has just been, I feel a lot of gratitude about it.
And you were actively working here while you were going to school, right?
I was. So I guess I would be considered a bit of a non-traditional student. So I graduated Salem High School in 1976. And as a very young, and I will say now immature 17-year-old at Westfield State, did not do well, was not a very good student. And at the end of my first year, after talk with my parents, he said, "You're not going back." And so I started at Salem State. And I will tell you, it took me a long time to graduate. I started, I stopped, I started, I took a few classes, dropped out a couple of times, and didn't finish until 1987.
And as part of your finishing here at the university in 87, what did life look like for you kind of those next several years out of undergraduate?
Yeah, I look back now, and I was not a good student my first few years here. And I actually became finally a good student when I was working full-time on the police department. I can remember I was brand new in the police department. I was working midnights, and I would get off at 8 in the morning. They'd let me go about 7:45. I'd be sitting in class at 8 o'clock. And I finally, something clicked. I got it. The teachers here, the criminal justice faculty, they made me work. And Ed LeClaire and Carol Ficella and just a tremendous criminal justice faculty here. I finally got it. And I felt like a good student, even though I was working probably 50 or 60 hours a week. I had a young family at the time. And when I graduated in 87, my son, who's going to be 40, was just a couple of years old, and my daughter a year behind him. And it's because of the faculty here that got me on the path that for any success that I've been fortunate enough to have, the path was in those mid-1980s years here in the criminal justice program.
And after you graduated, then you transitioned to a position within Salem PD, right?
I did. I enjoyed my time here working. I worked there for about 2.5 years. And then part of that gap in going to school is I worked on the Nashua, New Hampshire Police Department for about 2.5 years.
Okay.
And remember the time, so this is early 1980s. And I remember interviewing for the job up in Nashua. And the chief up there was a solid old ex-Marine. And I thought I would make some points by saying I had some college behind me and I was going to try to keep going to finish. And he said, "We want working police officers. We don't need college boys." And I said, "Yes, sir." Not what I wanted to do. Yeah. So I ended up coming back when I came back to Salem State, and I was on the police department here in Salem and working very hard. And then finally being able to graduate which helped me tremendously on the job. Pretty quickly on from there, I was able to start advancing. I became a detective, took the sergeant's exam, made sergeant. I made another pretty good decision, which was to continue on for master's. I got a master's from Anna Maria College in Worcester, and then several years later, ended up going to law school. But the other great thing was being on campus, being a little bit older and much more mature than I was when I was first in college. And interestingly enough, seeing students, I know this may shock some people, by night I might have been breaking up some college parties, and by day I might have been in class sitting next to a few of them. We had some pretty good laughs about that. So, but I've been very blessed.
When your time, when you felt like your career in law enforcement had started to kind of wrap up and come to its end, you then succeeded that career in law enforcement by becoming the next state rep for Essex County, or
Yes.
for Salem specifically.
Yep.
Following kind of in the seat that was vacated by President Keenan, from what I understand,
Yes.
several years ago.
Yes.
What was it about that transition where you said, you know what, I've had this incredible career in law enforcement. Here's what I think I want to do next.
Yeah, so I had hit what's in public services called the magic numbers. I had 32 years, age 55, and that's for retirement purposes. I knew I didn't want to retire. I knew I wanted to continue public service. And when President Keenan called me to tell me that he was wrapping up his very distinguished 10-year career as a state rep, where he was a tremendous rep, very well respected, and had really made a good name for himself and for Salem, I talked to my wife, and I just thought that I saw the job that President Keenan had done there. And frankly, I said to my wife, I'm still the police chief. I'm going to run. If I lose the election, I'm still the police chief.
Mhm.
You know, nothing ventured, nothing gained. I was able to win, and I ran 3 more times after that. So I had 8 years at the State House as a rep, and it was a phenomenal experience. Everything I hoped it would be. The things I got to work on, the breadth of laws I got to work on, from education to public health to public safety. It was everything that I had imagined it would be. I was very, very grateful for my time there.
And if we could go back just for a second, because you mentioned a moment ago that you'd end up going to law school as
Yes.
well. One of the times you and I had talked, independent of this conversation, you had shared with me that you were kind of going back and forth on whether or not law school was going to be worth it, and you had a conversation with your wife about it.
Yeah.
And that was kind of what put you over the edge to go.
And but for that conversation, I wouldn't be sitting here right now. So I was 37 years old, and I had been a police captain for 5 years. I was the chief of detectives, a very demanding job. I had 3 young children, and just a conversation. Sometimes these things, there's a fork in the road in your life. Sometimes these things put you on a path. And I had a conversation with my wife, and I just said, I wish I had gone to law school. And I'll never forget, she said, well, why didn't you? Or why don't you? And I said, I'm too old now. I don't know if I can do it with the kids and the job. And she said, how long does it take? I said, well, it'd be nights. It'd be 3 or 4 years, depending on, how quickly I can get through. And she said, well, you'll be 40 or 41 with or without a law degree. The next week I went to the open house, and a couple of months later I started. And I do tell the story. My very first night in law school was August of 1997. And I was sitting there, very first night, and I looked at the person next to me, and I said, I don't know if I can do this. My son's playing an all-star baseball game tonight. I've never missed any of his games. I have a demanding job. And I came back the next night and the next night, and pretty soon, a couple of weeks were in, pretty soon the semester was in, and I just kept on going. Law school was an outstanding experience. Not only did it prepare me for the job I have now, but one of the true inspirational things that's happened in my life. When I graduated law school, took the bar exam, passed, I got a call from Salem State, from Ed LeClaire, and said, would you like to teach a class? And that started a 22-year run teaching. I taught one class every semester at South Campus, and I picked up a class at North Shore and Endicott as well to teach. And it's been the highlight of my life to be able to be on campus teaching the job that I had and the job that I love to young men and women going into the field that I gave 2/3 of my life to. It's been just, I'm full of gratitude for that opportunity.
So a few decades in service through Salem PD. Then you spend your 8 years in the House as well. As if that wasn't enough, there are those that I would consider myself to be one of these, what we might say a glutton for punishment. You decide to pursue your new role as district attorney for Essex County, what was it about this opportunity where you said, you know what, I'm ready to throw my hat in that ring?
Yeah, I had always worked closely with the DA's office. As in my 34-year police career, I was in detectives for about 23 or 24 of those years, and had worked closely with the office. And Essex County's been blessed with two phenomenal DAs, Kevin Burke and John Blodgett. 44 years between both their services. Just trailblazers, terrific guys, integrity, honesty. And when John Blodgett called me to tell me that he wasn't going to run again, I had been a lawyer for 20 years, had my police background, a bit of what some people might consider to be a non-traditional district attorney. I had never prosecuted a case, but I knew where I wanted to take the office. I knew the vision that I wanted. I knew the experience that I had. And I'll tell you, Essex County is a big county, 34 cities and towns, about 960,000 people. I thought I could do well down here in the North Shore just because I had been around for a while. But it really was up in Lawrence and Methuen and Haverhill where I spent a lot of time. I campaigned for a full year. And on election night, I was fortunate enough to win. And in November of that year, there was no Republican. So it was, all I had to do was get my vote and my wife's vote. And all I needed was a couple of votes. And so we got in. I was sworn in January. And it's been great. So we're coming up on 2 years now, and we've done some really good things in the office. So.
So in a role like this, for those that may be watching and not have a clear idea, can you kind of give us, and I'm sure there's never the same day twice, but can you give us kind of maybe a snapshot or an overview of some of the areas in which your office specifies?
So I think everybody knows the prosecution role. Everybody knows if you watch Law and Order or any of the police shows, you know what the prosecutor's role is in court. So in my office, there's a couple of different parts to it. Certainly we have prosecutors. We have about 180 employees. About half are attorneys and half is support staff. So we have victim witness advocates. We have juvenile justice coordinators. I also have 23 state troopers assigned to my office. By law, by statute, the district attorney of each county is in charge of any what's called unattended death. That might be an accidental death, a homicide, a suicide, unexplained death. All of that has to come through my office. We also work on big multi-jurisdictional cases as well. We've done some really big drug cases. And frankly, what a lot of people, I think, don't know is the work that we do on the prevention side. So we have a really strong and robust juvenile diversion and adult diversion, trying to keep kids out. We know that if somebody enters the system as a young teenager, they come into the incarceration system, they come into DYS, they come into juvenile court, chances are that recidivism, the fact that they're going to keep coming back, is very high. The longer we can keep them out, the much more chance of success they have. I spent the last 2 days at a conference in Norwood called the Emerging Adult Conference. It's this 16 to 24-year-old group that was still understanding the brain science development, understanding alternatives to coming into the system. Now, I hope folks don't misunderstand this, because sometimes people do things that are bad and there has to be consequences to it. A big part of my job, working with my team, is knowing when a person deserves a second chance and when they have to deserve the full consequences of the law. One of the things I think, honestly, that we missed for a long time is, particularly when it comes to substance use disorder and mental health, we had a punishment-based system for a long time. We missed the treatment, we missed the rehabilitation, we missed second chances. And it doesn't have to be dropping the hammer, tough on crime, and it doesn't have to be let's let everybody walk out the front door. A big part of the job, that, as I see it, is one, to have the vision, to have programs in place that work, and two, if we do have to make sure that the full weight of the law has to come down, to use it in a manner and in those cases when we know it's the right thing to do. I have a sworn duty for protecting the public as well, and for standing up for victims. So I think if somebody followed me around a day-to-day basis, you would see lots of different things. I'm not a sit behind the desk person. I want to be out. I was up this morning up in Newburyport with school officials talking about school behaviors and some of the issues that we've had. And our teachers right now, part of it by default, have become social workers, mentors, educators. They're doing everything. My hat's off. Our public school teachers at every level, including the collegiate level, I think are doing incredibly good work.
One of the things I admire about you the most and appreciate about you the most is that you sort of, whether from your time as a member of the Salem PD or as the representative for the district or now as the DA, is that you seem to walk a line that is not very easily walkable. And what I mean when I say that is that from your time as an elected official, somebody from your background in your professional area of practice, or the community or the role in which you serve, you were the Yes on Three initiative a few
Yes.
years ago.
Yep.
You were a strong advocate of that.
Yes.
And given the, let's call it, polarization that we find ourselves in these days, that coupled with, we see on the news every day that there's another school shooting happening somewhere, and as a person who was a staunch advocate for the Yes on Three initiative supporting the LGBTQ
Yep.
community, but also as a person who has lived in the space that understands why the public has a right to own a concealed weapon, and how it's founded in our origin documents as a nation, you have a way of communicating why both sides of a certain coin may be necessary for the public to realize and consider. And was there any one, people are often a product of their upbringing, right? But was there any one experience or time in your life where you said, this is why I feel like I can be the strongest voice for the most people?
Yeah. So I think it doesn't take any more than a glance at the news or the newspaper to see the polarization in this country right
Yeah.
now. And I think that's unfortunate. And one of the things I learned in political life, that you could be with somebody on 99% of the votes, they could support you. But if it's that one vote that somebody feels so strongly about, you could lose that person. What are we talking about? Gun rights, immigration, women's reproductive health. And one of the things that I've really tried to do is to keep a compass. And I remember you brought up the question three, Mike, and I did TV, I did radio because I felt strongly about it.
Mhm.
Our transgender community is a small community, often voiceless. And my feeling is, and I had people say to me, well, why'd you get involved in that? You know you're going to lose votes on that because people are so opposed to it. I said, well, I'd rather lose an election than not stand up for folks that don't have a voice. And I felt strongly about that. And I had a conversation with an older relative of mine. I hope this puts it in perspective on the transgender protection question. And I'd always been very strong on standing up for folks. And one of my older relatives said, I'm not sure about this. And I said, well, how would you feel if you worked all day at a restaurant, and at the end of the day, you take your apron off and you wash up and you go sit at the bar of a drink? You could be refused service because you're in the transgender community. And they said, that's not right. I said, that's why we need this protection. And I was very proud of Massachusetts and Salem, because there was a ballot question that tried to overturn the law. And we strongly, by over 70% in Salem, we stood up for folks. And that's just one example. The gun question is also a good one, too. People say to me, oh, you must be a gun guy. You carried a gun for 35 years. Well, I did because I had to for my job. But I also say I believe the Second Amendment. I believe in common sense. I don't think anybody should have an automatic rifle, an AR-15. I don't think anybody needs some of these military-style weapons. There's no place for it in society. But as long as you conform to the law, and you're vetted and your name is in the database having run through, and there's no mental health issues of any significance, things like that, then the Second Amendment says you can have a gun. On all of these, I look at how I feel about it, and even when people come in, I do try to talk to people to understand. And not that I'm trying to change everybody's opinion on a lot of these issues, but I want them to understand where I'm coming from. And it doesn't always work. I mean, I could show you, I could probably write a book on some of the emails that I've gotten over the years that people disagreed with me on things. But you know what? In public life, there's ways you can do the job and ways you shouldn't. I think you have to be able to stand up, articulate why we're a representative democracy. You're going to stand up, and if somebody has a better idea, you listen to it. And I don't think I have the corner on the market of knowing everything. But I meant that when I said I'd rather lose an election than have to compromise on something that I felt strongly about. So,
And you know what, I just love the integrity with which you stand up and say that. I mean, because it can, in the end, there may be a whole swath of people that say this isn't the road we want to go down, but you can go to sleep at night knowing that you
yep.
stood up for what was right and true. And I certainly appreciate
Yep.
that. And I think to a certain extent, that's kind of the testament of the community that we on a larger scale that we have here at the college, right? We try to be a place that everyone feels welcome. You're going to meet some people that have a different opinion than
Yep.
you. That's part of the collegiate experience. You
Yep.
get exposed to things that you may not have heard or lived growing up, and it's a big world out there, and not everybody's going to agree with what you have to say.
I see it every day, and from President Keenan, the tone that he sets and the vision he has, all the way down through the ranks to the students. I know there's a great designation, the Hispanic Serving Institution. That's phenomenal. So happy to see that. The civic engagement on this campus is amazing. I know because I've been up here. I've come up when they've done voter registration drives and different things. The civic engagement, it's important. That's a message from the president's office all the way down. Everybody understands it. There's a lot going on. There's a lot of unrest across campuses, and campuses have always been a place where ideas and free flow of information, that's an important part of our society. But it also, I believe, has to be done with certain decorum and done a certain way, because you do not have the right to infringe on somebody else's rights. You can certainly be heard. I just did a Zoom with about 125 people on what you can do to protest and what you can't. And I think folks, it was a bit eye-opening for some folks of what some of the limitations are, but we live in a free democracy, and sometimes that balance can be a little delicate.
Thinking back, you mentioned earlier that for 22 years you were an adjunct faculty member, right? So this question may be a little bit different for you, but as someone who was in front of students for such a long time, take that out of the equation for a second if you could. If there's a student watching this conversation right now that says, you know what, I could see myself following that path, what do you think a piece of advice would be that you would give them to kind of get them pointed and started in the right direction?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I would say start early, following the path, start to set yourself up. One of the things that I tell people a lot, you've got to do something in your life to separate yourself from the crowd, so to speak. And here's what I mean by that. And in policing, let's say in Salem, somebody wants to be a Salem police officer, they're here at the university, they're in criminal justice. There might be 10 openings a year. There's going to be several hundred people that put in. I think you've got to look in the mirror and say, what can I do to separate myself from the crowd? Because this is going to be an educated group. There's going to be people that are dedicated, but what is it that I can do to separate myself from it? Is it doing something on the civic engagement side? Is it, some of my students joined the National Guard, and all of these things. Some went to get an EMT. There are things that you can do to separate yourself from the pack, to say, you know what, I wish everybody well, but here's why I think I should get that whatever that position is. I know I've had students that have gone into local, state, federal law enforcement, into probation. I've had nursing students that sat in on my class just to take it as an elective, and I have a few students that say, you know what, I switched my major. I think that's the value of having such a strong faculty that we have here. And I taught at North Shore for a long time, and my suggestion always was, when you get your associate's degree, come right here, finish, and get a bachelor's. You'll be well prepared from North Shore, and you'll even be more prepared when you leave here. It's a difficult world out there, and I also want people to be informed. The days, if there's any frustrations, I guess, that I've had since I've been in political life, it's seeing things on social media that I know aren't true. And if they're just criticizing me, that's fine. You have to have a thick skin. But sometimes I see on social media people being very unfair to others when I know what they're saying is not true. And one thing I've always been careful about, we run a program called Think Before You Send. We do it for juveniles. I think sometimes an adult might benefit from that as well. But the students leaving here are very well prepared, and I think this university has a good reputation. And if you're an employer, you're going to take a good look at somebody coming from here.
So in the last probably year and a half or so, as I've started to dive into this work a little bit more, I get to meet people like you. I get to meet people like, Representative Jess Giannino. And then all of a sudden you start to see these little Salem State fingerprints throughout the Commonwealth, and specifically at the State House. And I had an opportunity to go see Representative Giannino last summer, and she gave me a tour. Then we did an event just before spring break this past year where you were kind enough to join
Yep.
us, and it was all
Yep.
of our alternative spring break students meeting with folks that were working in the Commonwealth or around the State House, or for some maybe state agencies around the State House. But um, it gives you a proper perspective of, to your point, how well students are prepared to enter this particular type of the workforce when they graduate.
I always love public events. When
Yeah,
Lieutenant Governor
yeah,
Kim
of course,
Driscoll,
of course.
when she introduced myself, Senator Joan Lovely,
Hmm.
Rep. Tom Walsh, Rep. Jess Giannino, it's a source of pride for all of us.
Yeah,
And we always say we're proud Vikings.
yeah,
And that footprint, as you said, Mike, it's just growing.
yeah.
And there are sectors all across from business, education. This university has a big footprint, a great history, and it's funny when I was a rep, I would get phone calls, and people would say, "Oh, my son or daughter didn't get into Salem. Can you help?" And Dr. Bryant was always very helpful to me. And whenever I picked up the phone, he said, "Please don't tell me it's for nursing. The nursing program here is so competitive. It's so hard to get into, but we're turning out nurses that hospitals and medical places, they want the Salem State nurse because they know they're well prepared."
Yeah.
So
It's that. I mean, there's so much, right? And this is probably one of the, I would imagine, more interesting things you've seen throughout your career in law enforcement and public service is that, maybe back in the 80s and 90s, even to the extent in the early 2000s, that maybe back then it was just, criminal justice degree, lived experience, that kind of stuff. But now you're seeing an influx of departments having psychologists and social workers, because we realize that at the root of something like substance abuse, it's not just a wanted behavior. There's something else that may be triggering these people. And so, as I mentioned earlier, kind of that line that you walk, one of the other things I appreciate in the work that you do is that you take a very holistic approach to everything and looking at it and saying, what's really the root cause here, and can we prevent that from happening again?
yeah, so when I was on the police department in 2007, Chief Bob St. Pierre and I was a captain. We started a unit called the Community Impact Unit, and it actually came from an article I had read about how the police officers that we see in the cruises, they're going from call to call to call. Detectives, where I spent most of my career, are on long-term investigations. But in that middle, you've got folks that are housing insecure, that were homeless, that are on the streets with substance use disorder, with mental health issues, oftentimes dual diagnosis. And what was happening was we're picking these folks up. They end up going in court for minor quality of life crimes, drinking in public, trespassing, urinating in public, and they go in front of the judge. They get a date to come back. Of course, they're going to default. So oftentimes, because they have no means, and they end up back before the court. Next, thing you know, they're at the Middleton House of Correction for 2, 3, 4 months.
Yeah.
And at the time, it's much different now, but at the time, no services, no mental health treatment, no medical assisted treatment. 3 months of probably $10,000 a month to housing. What happens? They come back on the street again. It's rinse, wash, repeat, recycle. Fortunately, with the Community Impact Unit and now Sheriff Carpenter at the Middleton facility, the Sheriff's Department, they're doing all kinds of treatment. It's so different now. Clearly, still lots of work to do. We have a homeless population downtown. LifeBridge, I'm a big supporter of LifeBridge. Jason Etheridge and the group there. But you're right. It is a holistic approach. When I was the captain, we were the first police department to hire clinical social workers on the streets, in the cruisers with police officers. Never been done before. Almost everybody's doing it now. We talk a lot about de-escalation. Police officers in their training, my training, 1981, I was in the police academy. It was hands-on, it was physical fitness, it was push-ups, sit-ups, running, and it was defensive tactics. Now, as it should, I like to think we're a lot more enlightened. It's de-escalation. It's understanding people's issues. It's dealing with special populations. When I was at the State House, one of the bills that I got passed was to do a 4-hour block of training in the police academy dealing for folks with special populations, people on the autism spectrum. And we had autism families from Mass, AFMA came in, phenomenal folks. And they brought their family members in as advocates. And it was phenomenal. We got it passed. So those kinds of things are happening. Much different than 40 plus years ago when I started. We're in a much better place now.
As you think back to the 40 plus years ago when you first started, one of the things I always like to ask people is, if you could see yourself doing anything different, what would it be? And if
Yeah.
not, would you change anything? Maybe a decision that you made when you were younger that brought you
Yeah.
to today.
So I've thought about this because, now with, I guess, with a little bit of wisdom and gray hair, I can look back and see what I've done. So I wanted to do two things in my life. And at the time it was an either or. It was either be a police officer or be a high school teacher and coach basketball and track. And I kind of got to do both. I had a long career in policing and I got to teach for 22 years. So I feel like I fulfilled both. But if I was unable to get on the police department back then, when I first got on, it was really hard job to get. I would have wanted to be a high school teacher and a basketball and track coach. So
Fair enough.
yeah,
Um, the last question I'd love to ask you, and this is the one that I kind of close every conversation with. Actually, no, before I get to that, because I'm generally curious, a guy as busy as you, understanding that particularly stressful work like what you've done for the last 40 years, acknowledging over the last 5 specifically as we navigated the pandemic that
yeah,
taking care of yourself is very important.
yeah.
So what are you listening to? What are you reading? How are you taking care of yourself on these especially stressful days?
Yeah, it's funny you say that. I was at an event this morning, and the speaker was a psychiatrist, and he gave a 20-minute talk, which was fabulous. And the first question he said, "How many people are in the business of taking care of people?" Every single person raised their hand. He said, "How many people are doing really good about self-care?" Not one hand went up. So I've always liked sports. I played up until a couple of years ago. I played basketball. I played in an over 50 league. And for about 20 years, I was part of a group. We played every Sunday morning at South Campus.
Mhm.
I just bought an e-bike. Um, I started reading again. I had gotten away from reading. So I just read 2 pretty good books. Actually, both were very good. Doris Kearns Goodwin, An Unfinished Love Story, was fabulous. The story of her husband's sort of trek through history. He was a guy that was sort of beside the president at the time, Kennedy and Johnson, and a view of the world through his eyes. And I just read a book. It's called "It's Your Ship." It's by a guy named Captain Michael Abrashoff, retired Navy captain. It's a quick read, but it's how to manage people,
Mhm.
and it's how to get the most. And it's your ship. It talks about how he took over a ship in the Navy that had been having some problems, and how he brought it to what, by his account and many others, the number one ship in the Navy.
Yeah.
So it was pretty good. So
And just really quickly, I mean, just from a perspective standpoint, you say that in your office currently there are something like 23, 25, 27 state troopers inside
yes,
your office. How
yeah.
big is your office as an entity right now?
So we have a footprint in every courthouse in Essex County. The main office is downtown. So about 180 civilian lawyers, victim witness, and 23 troopers. So a little over 200.
Wow.
And it's a big operation. But our team is phenomenal. And as you can imagine, we work on some really tough cases. I've been DA now for almost 2 years, and early on, within the first 6 or 7 weeks, we had some really terrible crimes, and unfortunately, we've seen quite a bit. We've had some great success stories. We've helped a lot of people, but the job can be very difficult, and I worry about the self-care of the folks I work with. I'll tell you a quick story if we have time.
Sure.
So over the course in Massachusetts of about 2 months, there was 3 awful, awful crimes. One in Essex County and 2 down closer to the Cape. Homicides, family members involved. And a TV reporter came up to me and he said, "Hey," he said, "I've been watching how you're doing." He said, "How's the stress level?" And I kind of brushed off a little bit. And he said, "The reason why I asked," he said, "I've covered," and he mentioned the 3 cases where he did the live reporting. And he said, "I'm a reporter." He said, "I'm safe from this stuff, but it's starting to get to me. And if it's getting to me, then it's getting to you and it's getting to your troopers." And so we talk a lot about that just to make sure that we know that if somebody needs any type of assistance, or if there's something we can do. When I was first on the police department, it was something bad happened during the shift. End of the shift, you're at the bar. You're going to have 2 or 3 or 4 beers with the guys before you go home. And that's the way it was handled. So different now.
And as a kid who grew up with a firefighter as a father, he was part of a practice called critical incident stress management, which
Yep.
was designed for people on the job that experienced significant trauma, and some of it. So even back then, and I don't think it's to the extent that it is now, but there was a recognition that the good old days of the ways of handling things weren't going to work for
Yeah.
much longer.
Yeah.
he actually trained in that right before the attacks of September 11th. And so
Wow.
he was deployed to New York for a while, and he was like, the tendency for these guys to just want to go drown their sorrows was
Yeah.
high, and you have to try to talk people out of it
Yeah.
because it's stressful work. It's hard work. It's
Yeah.
not punching in at 9 and punching out at 5 and leaving it at the door when you go. So I really want to commend you for taking that step to acknowledge that there are people, especially in your team and the nature of the work that you do, that if the reporters are feeling it,
Yeah.
then your team is probably feeling it too.
Yeah. Definitely.
I think one of the things that I'd love to ask you before we wrap up here is, with the benefit of 40 years of hindsight, being a member of the city and specifically the campus, what do you think the biggest change that you've loved to see over the years that's taken place here at the college would be, in terms of, when you started in the 80s versus where we are now? One of the things that you look back and you go, wow, like this is really something special. I mean, for me, I know as a student, I've always been a marvel at the speaker series that we've had and the people that have come.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
I've gotten to meet both times when the presidents have been here. President Bush, 41,
Mm-hmm.
President Clinton, Prime Minister of Pakistan, Benazir Bhutto was here. And because of my job, as I was the captain in charge of detectives, I actually worked side by side with the Secret Service, and actually kind of cool. I got to go out on the runway when the presidents landed. President Clinton, when President Clinton came here, it was his first public appearance after he left the White House, which is always like the big deal. The first one, it was here. I got to stand out in the field when Tom Brady landed in his helicopter at the O'Keefe Center. So that was pretty cool too. I just think that the stature of the university has just grown. I think there was a feeling probably 40 or 50 years ago that many of the state universities was sort of like the safe school. It's just a state school. I don't see that anymore. This university and what's happened with the upgrade in the facilities. I've always thought there's been a tremendous faculty here, and there's the other piece, having grown up here, and I think about this a lot because in President Keenan we have a leader who knows the city, was born and brought up here. And Dr. Harrington, we had somebody that was born and brought up here. I think back in the 70s and 80s, there was a tendency, and this is not to give too much history, but just to put it in perspective, I think there was always a feeling like the college felt like, we can kind of do what we want here. We're the big guy in the neighborhood, and we don't care about parking and traffic and all that stuff. That was the feeling. That has changed so much. Not only is the university a good neighbor, it is seen now. How do the economic benefits and just the social benefits of having a university here, that's not lost on the people in Salem now. And I think, continued right through President Keenan's leadership, I think the university is seen not only as a good neighbor, but a vital part of the city. Salem State, without Salem, we wouldn't be the same city.
I think that's an interesting point that you make. As I finished my tenure here as a student in the early 2000s, that was when Lieutenant Governor, then Mayor Driscoll, was just beginning her tenure. And it really is a one hand washing the other, because the city, even just since 2007 when I graduated, has grown and changed so much. And as an institution, you can then say, look at all that we have to offer prospective students, right? But then so many of those businesses that have grown and flourished under the last 17, 18 years are supported. October's a terrific time, November is as well, but there's another 10 months of the year when who's in town? It's just the residents and the college students. And so it really has been a terrific change to see, and I appreciate you saying that. So again, I just really want to thank you for your time and the opportunity to speak with you and get to hear your story. I know you're extraordinarily busy, but just really appreciate you carving the time out for us today.
Thanks, Mike. Appreciate it. Good luck to all the students.
I want to thank everybody for watching along. It's been another episode of It Takes a Viking, the official podcast of the Salem State University Alumni and Friends community. My name is Mike Mitchell, and until next time, thanks for watching.